They say some stories never really die. They just drift beneath the waves, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. This one began with a storm. Not just any storm, but one so powerful it tore apart the empires of men and gave birth to a nation that shouldn't have existed at all, a republic born not from law but from chaos. It's the story of Nassau, the Republic of Pirates. A place where outlaws built a democracy, where men condemned as criminals wrote laws more fair than kings ever dared to. And it all began in silence. The year was 1715. Across the harbours of England, a peculiar quiet had settled over the docks. For 13 long years, Europe had been at war, the War of the Spanish Succession. It was a war that had stretched across oceans, fueling fortunes, crowning heroes, and legitimizing the brutal art of sea warfare. Now the Treaty of Utrecht had been signed. The cannons fell silent, the blood-soaked flags were lowered, and what was left was stillness. In the port of Bristol, that stillness felt heavier than gunpowder. Inside the Anchor Inn, pipe smoke hung thick over wooden tables scarred by knives and spilled ale. Men gathered there, not just sailors but former privateers, legal pirates, once blessed by the crown to hunt its enemies. They had lived like kings of the sea, striking Spanish galleons and French merchants under royal commission. But now those commissions were nothing but parchment and fading ink. At a shadowed corner table sat Thomas Barrow, his calloused hands gripping a pewter mug. He stared at the paper tucked inside his sea chest, the letter that once made him a predator of empires. Now it was worthless. Around him whispers filled the air. "What's a man to do now?" murmured James F., a gunner known for crippling enemy ships with a single shot. "Go back to hauling merchant cargo for a shilling a month?" No one answered, because they all knew the war had made them rich, but peace had made them obsolete. Similar scenes played out in Portsmouth, London, and every English harbour. Captain Benjamin Hornigold, a name that would soon echo through history, stood among his old crew, men who once followed him into battle. They watched him expectantly, waiting for orders that would never come. There were no more French frigates to ambush, no Spanish galleons heavy with gold, no sanctioned enemies to chase. And that's when something quiet but monumental began to happen. The transformation from privateer to pirate wasn't born from one act of defiance. It happened slowly, like a tide. A realization spreading through hundreds of seamen that the skills they'd learned in service of the crown could serve them better, for themselves. The Caribbean was already a blur between law and lawlessness. During the war, England's privateers had used Jamaica and the Bahamas as staging grounds to attack Spanish treasure fleets. They learned every secret of the Caribbean, the winds, the reefs, the hidden channels that could swallow a ship whole. They knew where the treasure fleets sailed, how long it took gold from Potosi to reach Havana, and when the Spanish would be most vulnerable. And when peace came, these men didn't stay in England. They drifted back to those same islands where the line between patriot and pirate was only a matter of paperwork. Some still carried their royal commissions as shields, waving them at British captains to avoid arrest. But others dropped the act entirely. They knew what the rest were only beginning to realize. The age of legal piracy was over, and the age of illegal fortune had just begun. By mid-1715, Spain was once again extracting the wealth of the Americas. Silver from Potosi, gold from New Granada, pearls from Venezuela. It all traveled one way toward the mother country, and guarding those treasures were the legendary Spanish treasure fleets. For 2 centuries, they had carried the riches of the New World home, sailing predictable routes across the Caribbean. To a hungry ex-privateer, they were floating banks. In the Bahamas, one island began to draw them all in New Providence. Its harbor, Nassau, was perfect. Deep enough for large ships, shallow enough to hide from warships. Close enough to the Spanish trade routes, yet far from British control. What had been a quiet colonial outpost began to transform into something new, a pirate city. Ships arrived from every corner of the Atlantic, their crews bringing not just weapons but knowledge, which merchants would buy stolen cargo, which governors could be bribed, and which islands offered shelter when the Royal Navy came hunting. Then, in July 1715, fate delivered an opportunity unlike any before it. A Spanish treasure fleet, 11 ships set sail from Havana, heavy with over 6 million pieces of 8 gold bars and gems. It was commanded by Captain General Don Antonio de Echevis Izubiza, a veteran who'd crossed the Atlantic dozens of times. He expected a smooth voyage, but the Caribbean had other plans. That summer brought storms of unusual fury. The fleet waited until the weather calmed, but nature was only resting. On July 24th, the fleet left Havana. By the 30th, as it hugged the Florida coast, the skies turned a sickly gray. Winds rose, waves built like mountains. By nightfall, the hurricane struck with merciless power. Sailors prayed as the sea devoured their ships. 10 of the 11 vessels were destroyed. Bodies washed ashore near what is now Vero Beach. Chests of silver burst open underwater, scattering coins across the seabed like stars. Only one ship, the Griffon, survived. The Spanish scrambled to salvage what they could. Soldiers camped along the coast, guarding treasure buried beneath the waves. But word travels fast in the Caribbean. When the news reached Nassau, the pirates smelled blood. Captain Henry Jennings, a sharp, disciplined privateer turned opportunist, gathered a small fleet and struck the Spanish camps. His men attacked at dawn, taking everything they could carry. That single act, the looting of the 1715 fleet, lit the fuse. In taverns from Jamaica to Barbados, men toasted to Jennings' success. And they began to sail toward Nassau. By the end of the year, Nassau's harbor looked like something out of legend. Sloops, brigantines, and captured merchant ships filled the bay, hundreds of them. The sound of hammers and forges echoed from the shore as shipwrights modified vessels for speed and battle. Blacksmiths repaired cutlasses, tavern keepers sold watered rum by the barrel. But Nassau wasn't just chaos, it was becoming something organized. And the man behind that order was Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold understood something most pirates didn't. To survive, they needed more than ships, they needed structure. Under his guidance, Nassau began to function like a small nation. Crews drew up articles of agreement, democratic codes that dictated everything. How loot was divided, how captains were elected, even compensation for injuries. A man who lost an arm might receive 600 pieces of 8. These weren't drunken criminals. They were craftsmen of rebellion. And soon Nassau had shipyards, markets, and even a rudimentary court system. It was a pirate republic in everything but name. British governors in Jamaica and Barbados grew uneasy. They sent reports to London describing Nassau as a nest of rogues, a phrase that history would make famous. But Britain was exhausted from war. Its navy was thin. And many of these rogues still carried old commissions signed by the Crown itself. So the Empire watched and waited. That silence gave Nassau time. Time to become something powerful. By 1716, the settlement thrived. Ships came from everywhere, bringing plundered Spanish silver and exotic cargo. Taverns overflowed with coin and laughter. But beneath the rum and bravado, something remarkable was taking shape. A functioning democracy. Every crew elected its officers. Every captain had one vote in the Council of Captains, a governing body that decided Nassau's fate. They debated strategy, resolved disputes, and created rules that balanced freedom with order. In an age when kings ruled by divine right, these pirates practiced self-government. And their success didn't go unnoticed. Sailors in Port Royal whispered about a place where merit mattered more than birth. Merchants feared it, yet secretly traded with it. Spanish governors called it blasphemy. To them, Nassau wasn't just a port, it was a challenge to the entire world order. But the most astonishing part of this story wasn't just its politics. It was the personalities men whose ambition and ideals shaped what came next. Because as the Republic grew, so too did the legends of the pirates who led it. And none would shine brighter than Samuel Bellamy. Samuel Bellamy's ship cut through the Caribbean waters like a blade of black glass. To the men of Nassau, his arrival felt different. He didn't come as a desperate man looking for fortune, he came as a visionary. Bellamy had been a privateer once, like the rest, but unlike most who'd fallen into piracy for greed or survival, he brought with him ideas, dangerous ones, ideas about fairness, freedom, and equality among men who had spent their lives under the heel of kings. He came to Nassau in the spring of 1717, and from the moment he stepped off his sloop, people talked about him. He was tall, lean, sun-darkened, with hair so black it caught the light like oil. He carried himself not as a criminal, but as a man with purpose. His clothes were simple but cut with care-fine linen, polished boots, and a look that spoke of discipline. He didn't shout orders or boast of plunder. He spoke softly, and when he did, people listened. In the taverns of Nassau, where rum loosened tongues and tempers equally, Bellamy's voice carried something that hadn't existed there before conviction. "They damn us for villains," he told a merchant captain who'd been taken prisoner. "But what is the difference? They rob the poor under the cover of law, while we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage. They make honesty a sin, and call corruption justice." The men who heard him repeated those words in whispers across the island. To them, he wasn't just another captain chasing silver. He was giving meaning to what they'd already begun to feel, that Nassau wasn't merely a refuge for thieves. It was an experiment. A new kind of society. Bellamy's philosophy took hold like a spark in dry wood. Crews began rewriting their own articles of agreement, modeling them after his ideas. Some called it the Gentleman Pirate's Code, a set of rules that elevated piracy from mere theft to something more symbolic. Prisoners were to be treated fairly, women were to be left unharmed, loot would be divided equally, and officers could be voted out at any time. And when Bellamy took a prize, he didn't gloat. He treated captured sailors as equals. Some even joined him willingly, claiming they'd rather serve under a pirate's democracy than a king's tyranny. Under Bellamy's influence, Nassau thrived like never before. The harbor, once a scattered collection of rogue ships, now resembled a floating fleet. Operations were planned like military campaigns. Information flowed through a network of spies and merchants across the Caribbean. Spanish treasure routes were charted meticulously. Convoys were stalked not by chance, but by calculation. For the first time, piracy wasn't chaos, it was strategy. The results were staggering. Within months, Nassau's pirates captured enough treasure to rival small nations. Silver, tobacco, fine silks, barrels of sugar all flowed into the harbor. And for every coin earned, there was a story of raids that struck like lightning and vanished before dawn, of Spanish warships humiliated by coordinated pirate attacks, of ordinary sailors becoming rich beyond imagination. But with success came attention. The Spanish crown, furious at the loss of its treasure fleets, increased its patrols. The British Empire, embarrassed by its own former sailors now defying its authority, began to reconsider its tolerance. And yet for now, Nassau seemed untouchable. Protected by reefs and defended by men with nothing to lose, it was as close to invincible as any outlaw nation could be. Still, the greatest test of Nassau's unity came not from outside, but from within. As wealth poured in, new questions arose. Who would lead? How would power be shared? Could a republic of pirates founded on freedom survive ambition? The answers would come in the form of another man, Edward Teach. When Blackbeard arrived in Nassau, he brought with him thunder. He came from the same world as Hornigold, once a privateer, seasoned in battle, but driven by something darker. Tall, broad, and imposing, he understood one thing better than any other pirate alive: fear. He turned it into art. Teach grew his beard thick and long, weaving into it slow-burning fuses that smoked during battle. When flames licked the air around his face, he looked less like a man and more like an apparition from the deep. Spanish sailors who survived encounters with him swore he was the devil himself. They said the smoke around his head glowed red as blood, and that he laughed when cannonballs struck his hull. In truth, Blackbeard was far more calculated than the legends suggest. He didn't crave chaos, he engineered it. Where Bellamy inspired through ideals, Blackbeard commanded through spectacle. He turned piracy into theater. His ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a stage painted black, its decks lined with skulls, its flag adorned with a skeleton toasting death. He built his reputation carefully. When word spread that he'd once blockaded Charleston and held an entire city hostage for ransom, few realized how little violence he actually needed. The fear alone did the work. Captains surrendered before a single shot was fired. Because everyone knew if you saw smoke rising from that black-bearded face, your fate was already sealed. In Nassau, Blackbeard's arrival caused ripples. Some saw him as a genius, others as a curse. Hornigold admired his discipline. Bellamy respected his skill, but others whispered that his methods would bring ruin to everything they'd built. Meetings of the Council of Captains turned heated. Should they embrace his tactics of intimidation and chaos, or stick to the gentleman's code? Bellamy argued for restraint, for order and principle. Blackbeard argued for power. Fear keeps men in line, he told them. Law never did. The vote narrowly favored Bellamy's side, but the rift was now open. Two visions of piracy stood in opposition, one moral, one monstrous. Blackbeard left Nassau soon after, taking with him a faction of captains who believed strength, not fairness, would preserve their freedom. They sailed north, raiding ports and choking trade routes until the name Blackbeard became legend. Meanwhile, Bellamy continued to lead raids guided by his code, humane, precise, almost noble. It was this approach that earned him the nickname the Gentleman Pirate. But destiny is cruel to those who challenge power too openly. In early 1717, Bellamy's ship was caught in a violent storm off Cape Cod. The sea that had given him his dream took it away. Only 2 men survived. News of his death reached Nassau months later. Men who had once followed him toasted his memory in silence. They knew they'd lost more than a leader, they'd lost their conscience. Without Bellamy's influence, Nassau began to change. The younger captains grew restless, hungrier for blood and profit. And into that growing void stepped men like Charles Vane, a pirate who had no patience for democracy, no code but his own. Vane ruled through violence. He tortured captives, burned ships for pleasure, and turned Nassau's harbor into a place of whispers and fear. He mocked Hornigold's leadership and dismissed Bellamy's ideals as weakness. Where Bellamy's code had promised fairness, Vane's reign brought brutality. The Republic of Pirates, once the boldest social experiment in the world, began to rot from within. The winter of 1718 brought with it more than storms. It brought reckoning. From London came a name that would haunt Nassau forever: Woodes Rogers. A former privateer himself, Rogers was everything the Crown needed: a man who understood pirates better than anyone. And he came not to parley, but to end them. He sailed into Nassau's harbor with British warships and a royal proclamation. A full pardon for any pirate who surrendered voluntarily. Death for any who refused. The pirates were divided. Hornigold, pragmatic as ever, saw the truth their time was over. He accepted the pardon and urged others to do the same. Vane called it treason. "We built this island," he shouted, "and we'll die before we bow to a king." But many of his men no longer shared his fire. The rum had soured, the gold was fading, and the world around them was closing in. Rogers's amnesty drew hundreds from hiding. Ships that once flew the black flag now carried the Union Jack. For a moment, Nassau stood on the edge of transformation between the dream of rebellion and the order of empire. Yet not everyone surrendered. Charles Vane escaped under fire, vowing revenge. He gathered what remained of the radical faction men too violent or proud to bend. Among them was Calico Jack Rackham, a cunning pirate known for his brightly patterned clothes and unshakable charm. Rackham's story, however, would take a turn Nassau had never seen before. Because with him sailed two women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The tavern on Nassau's southern edge was louder than usual that night. Music bled through the open shutters, the rough rhythm of fiddles and boots striking wooden floors. It was a place of laughter, of spilled rum, and boasts of daring raids. But in one corner, away from the crowd, a man in bright calico clothing leaned back in his chair, smiling at a woman who looked entirely out of place among the noise. Her name was Anne Bonny, and she would change everything. Anne had fire in her eyes, not the kind of temper bred from rum or arrogance, but something deeper, the look of someone who refused to be told who she was. Born in Ireland, raised in the Carolinas, she'd seen both poverty and privilege, but nothing had prepared her for the wild, intoxicating freedom of Nassau. Calico Jack. John Rackham was unlike any man she'd known. His words weren't the crude come-ons of a tavern drunk, but calm and sharp, wrapped in humor that cut just enough to be dangerous. He didn't treat her like a woman to be tamed. He treated her like a partner, an equal. And in that equality, she found something she'd been denied her entire life. Their partnership began in whispers, a rumor, a scandal, a rebellion within a rebellion. When Jack proposed that she sail with him, she didn't hesitate. The men of Nassau laughed when they heard. A woman aboard a pirate ship. It was a curse, they said, a distraction. But Rackham silenced them with a grin. "She fights better than half of you," he told them, "and she doesn't complain when the powder's wet." Anne proved him right. During their first raid together, a Spanish sloop attempted to flee. Rackham's men hesitated. The seas were rough, the wind turning unpredictable. Anne took the helm, steady as iron. When the cannon fired, her shot struck the enemy's mast clean through. By dusk, the Spanish flag was gone, replaced by the black banner of Rackham's crew. From that day forward, no one questioned her again. But Anne wasn't the only one who would challenge everything the world thought it knew about piracy. Months later, another woman would join them, one whose courage and cunning would match Anne's blow for blow. Mary Read. Mary's story was stranger still. Born in England to a single mother, she'd been disguised as a boy for most of her youth, a deception meant to protect her mother's inheritance. The disguise had become her life. She joined the army, fought in battles, lived among men as one of them. When peace came, she drifted to the sea, taking work wherever she could. But the sea, like fate, is never predictable. Her ship was captured by pirates. When they gave her the choice, join or die, she joined. It wasn't until later that the crew discovered who she really was. And by then, it didn't matter. Mary had proven herself in blood and storm. When Anne met Mary aboard Rackham's ship, the two recognized something familiar in each other, that rare, dangerous kind of strength, born from surviving a world that wanted them small. They became inseparable. Together, they fought side by side in battles that became legend. Their enemies never suspected that two of the fiercest fighters on Rackham's deck were women. Anne wielded pistols with deadly precision. Mary favored the cutlass, fast and brutal. When they stormed ships, they led from the front, not behind the men, but through them. To sailors who lived to tell the tale, the sight of those two women standing among the smoke and cannon fire seemed like an omen, two ghosts of vengeance, laughing in the chaos. Rackham's ship, the Revenge, became infamous not only for its colorful captain, but for the women who fought under its flag. The story spread through every harbor in the Caribbean, growing more exaggerated with each telling. Some claimed Anne and Mary bewitched men into fighting for them. Others said they were cursed, that storms followed wherever they sailed. But those who actually knew them said something different. They said the women fought because they wanted to prove what no one else dared to believe, that courage, loyalty, and strength weren't bound by gender. And as the crew's legend grew, so did their enemies. By 1719, the golden age of Nassau was fading. Spanish and British patrols crisscrossed the Caribbean. Rogers's amnesty had thinned the ranks of the old pirate captains, and those who remained were hunted relentlessly. Rackham knew the days of open rebellion were numbered. He began to move quietly, striking small targets, trading loot for supplies through secret channels. His ship avoided major ports, anchoring instead in hidden coves where palm trees shielded them from view. But freedom bought with blood never lasts forever. One moonless night off the coast of Jamaica, the Revenge lay at anchor, its crew deep in drunken celebration. They had just taken a merchant brig heavy with sugar and rum, an easy victory, and a dangerous one. The noise of their celebration echoed across the water, drawing the attention of a British naval sloop patrolling nearby. The attack came before dawn. The Revenge's crew scrambled awake to the sound of cannon fire splitting the night. Men ran barefoot across the deck, fumbling for weapons. Rackham shouted for order, but it was chaos, drunken men stumbling through smoke and flame. Only two figures stood firm amid the panic, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They fought like demons, loading muskets faster than anyone else, firing into the dark. When the British boarded, they didn't fall back, they charged forward. One of the soldiers later testified that he'd never seen such fury. If every man fought like those two women, he said, we would never have taken the ship. But even courage has limits. Outnumbered and surrounded, Rackham's crew surrendered. In chains, they were taken to Port Royal for trial, the same place that had once been the heart of piracy, now turned against its own. The court was packed. The sight of two women pirates on trial drew crowds that spilled into the streets. The sentence was death for Rackham and his men. But when Anne and Mary were called before the judge, they revealed something that changed everything. They were both pregnant. Execution was postponed until after they gave birth, a decision that bought them time, but not freedom. Rackham was hanged soon after. Anne was allowed to see him one last time before the gallows. As he stood there, pale and broken, she told him, if you had fought like a man, you wouldn't need to die like a dog. Those words would echo through history. Mary Read died in prison soon after fever, they said. Anne Bonny's fate, however, became one of Nassau's enduring mysteries. Some say she was quietly released by her father's influence and disappeared into obscurity. Others claim she escaped, changed her name, and lived to an old age somewhere in the Carolinas, always looking out to sea. What's certain is that her story and Mary's became legends, whispered among sailors long after the Republic of Pirates had fallen. While Rackham's crew faced judgment, Nassau itself was transforming. Woodes Rogers's mission was working. The British flag now flew where once the black banners of rebellion had ruled. Former pirates worked for the Crown, patrolling the same waters they'd once terrorized. Benjamin Hornigold, The man who'd built Nassau's foundations now hunted those who refused to surrender. It was a bitter irony, and yet many accepted their new roles. They had families, debts, lives to rebuild. The dream of a pirate republic had died, but its spirit, the defiance that once defined Nassau, still lingered like salt in the air. But the Caribbean wasn't done with legends. In the chaos that followed Nassau's surrender, another name began to rise, a Welshman named Bartholomew Roberts. To some, he was the last great pirate. To others, the one who carried the torch of Nassau's ideals into its final chapter. Roberts had started as a merchant sailor, captured by pirates off the coast of Africa. When given the choice between death or the Black Flag, he chose the latter. Within weeks, his intelligence and composure caught the crew's attention. And when their captain was killed in a raid, Roberts was elected to replace him. He had been a pirate for less than 2 months. Roberts wasn't like the others. He didn't drink heavily, didn't chase chaos. He believed piracy could be disciplined, almost noble. Under him, order returned to the decks. He introduced rules, a code of behavior that rivaled anything written in the colonies. Every man aboard his ship signed an agreement. Loot was divided fairly. Fighting among the crew was punished by death. And no man was allowed to gamble with dice or cards. Roberts believed luck belonged only to the sea. Even in rebellion, he sought justice. His ship, the Royal Fortune, was a terror of the Atlantic. Sleek, fast, and bristling with guns, it was a floating city, a self-contained republic governed by the will of its crew. Roberts' men called him Blackbeard, and his reputation grew faster than any before him. From the Caribbean to Africa, he struck merchant convoys and warships alike. His fleet became a moving empire of rogues, operating under a strange but consistent sense of honor. Captured sailors often found themselves fed, clothed, and released with letters of warning. Those who joined him were treated as equals, no matter their race or origin, something unheard of in the rigid hierarchies of the colonial world. In many ways, Roberts represented the final evolution of Nassau's dream, a disciplined, democratic order built by outlaws. He turned piracy into something closer to philosophy, believing that rebellion was not just about wealth, but about justice. But his brilliance couldn't outlast the tide of history. By 1722, the British had mobilized their full naval power against him. One morning off the coast of West Africa, Roberts's fleet was ambushed. He fought to the end, refusing to surrender. A cannonball struck him through the throat. Before his body could be captured, his crew, following his final order, threw him into the sea. "Let the sea take me," he'd once said, "for no man shall hang Captain Roberts." And it did. With Roberts' death, the last flame of the Golden Age flickered out. By 1725, the Caribbean was quiet again. The black flags were gone, replaced by the red, white, and blue of empire. Nassau had become a respectable colony. Once more, its taverns converted into warehouses, its fort rebuilt for the king's soldiers. But though the Republic was gone, its echo remained. The democratic articles the pirates had written, those crude, hand-scrawled codes of equality and justice, outlasted their creators. Their spirit would resurface decades later in revolutions across oceans. Men would write constitutions that sounded eerily similar to the pirate codes once signed beneath the decks of ships like the Benjamin and the Royal Fortune. Freedom, after all, rarely begins in palaces. It begins in rebellion. The years that followed the fall of Nassau were quieter on the surface, but beneath that calm, the ghosts of the Republic still stirred. They lingered in whispers among sailors in Port Royal and Bridgetown, in the shanties sung beneath the decks of merchant ships, in the scars on men's hands who had once fought for freedom under the Black Flag. By 1725, The Caribbean belonged once again to the empires. British, Spanish, and French warships patrolled every major port. The old trade lanes were fortified. The harbors watched. The age of ungoverned waters had ended. Yet, somehow, pieces of that wild democracy lived on. In the shipyards of Kingston, some of the men hammering nails into royal frigates had once served under Hornigold or Rackham. Their stories didn't die. They were simply retold more quietly. Around firelight and rum bottles, they spoke of nights when every man had a voice, when votes were cast not by noblemen, but by sailors with calloused hands. They told of a time when justice was written in salt and wind, rather than parchment and seal. They never spoke too loudly. Empire had long ears. Woodes Rogers, the man who had crushed the pirate republic, became both hero and prisoner of his own victory. For a time, he ruled Nassau as a proper British governor, rebuilding its streets, erecting new stone buildings, fortifying its walls. He was lauded in London as the man who brought order to chaos, but Nassau's spirit, its defiance, slowly wore him down. Managing ex-pirates was no easy task. Many of them had taken pardons not because they desired redemption, but because they needed rest. They still fought, drank, and schemed like the old days. A few vanished into the sea again, taking to smuggling under the guise of trade. Rogers tolerated them at first. After all, trade was trade. But London expected obedience. The British governors before him had turned a blind eye. Rogers couldn't. He'd made his reputation on stamping out piracy, and he would die protecting that image. As the years went on, Nassau changed. The black flags were gone, but the people hadn't forgotten. In the market, women who once supplied pirates now sold bread to sailors. The children of outlaws ran errands for royal officers. The sea air carried two histories, one official, one whispered. Far from Nassau, other remnants of the pirate age drifted across the Atlantic. Some sailed to Africa, where old pirate havens dotted the coast. Others turned to privateering again under different flags, Spanish, French, even Dutch. A few vanished entirely, their ships never found. Their crews turned to rumor. But one legacy, more than any, endured, the Pirate Code. Long after the gallows in Port Royal rotted away, fragments of those old agreements resurfaced in ship logs, journals, and trial records. They revealed a structure far ahead of its time. Elected captains, councils for dispute, equal shares of profit, compensation for the injured. These men, branded as criminals, had unknowingly built one of the first working models of democracy at sea. There's a story told in the Bahamas, a quiet one, rarely written down. It says that some of the last pirates, those who refused both the king's pardon and the hangman's noose, didn't vanish at all. They hid. They say there's a chain of small islands east of New Providence where the reefs are so sharp and the water so shallow that no warship can approach. The story goes that in the years after Rogers' arrival, a handful of ships, crewed by men loyal to Bellamy's old code, sailed there and founded a secret settlement. No flags, no fortifications, no taverns, just small huts hidden among the palms, and a quiet harbor where their ships were kept out of sight. They called it Liberty Cay. No one ever found it, but every now and then fishermen would spot a light on the horizon, one single lantern swinging above the sea. When they sailed closer, it vanished. Most dismissed it as superstition, but the sailors whispered otherwise, that Liberty Cay still existed, that its people had chosen exile over surrender, and that they kept the black flag buried beneath the sand, waiting for the day it might fly again. What makes the story of Nassau so haunting isn't just its rise or fall, but what it revealed about human nature. The pirates were brutal, yes. They killed, they stole, but they also built. They created order from lawlessness, fairness from greed, equality from chaos. They had no kings, no nobles, no divine right. Every man earned his place by courage and skill. A ship became a floating parliament, its deck both courtroom and council chamber. In an age when most of Europe bowed to monarchs, the pirates of Nassau voted. That contradiction between violence and vision is what makes their story endure. They were men who sought justice through rebellion, freedom through defiance, and though their world was drowned in empire, their ideas survived. By the 1730s, piracy had been nearly eradicated. Woodes Rogers died in debt, his health ruined, his reputation fading. The empire he served had little use for men like him once the job was done. Nassau, though peaceful on the surface, was never the same. The fort that once defended the pirates now guarded royal trade. The taverns where Bellamy preached equality were replaced by merchant officers counting coins. But sometimes, on quiet nights, sailors swore they could still hear singing echoing across the harbor. A song of the old days, the anthem of the free. It went something like this. We drink to the tide, to the wind and the wave, to the bold and the damned, to the free and the brave. No crown, no creed, no master we serve, for the sea is our kingdom and freedom our nerve. It wasn't just a song, it was a memory. Even in London, far from the Caribbean sun, whispers of Nassau persisted. Philosophers and radicals began quoting from pirate articles, sometimes openly, sometimes disguised as maritime principles. The idea that men could govern themselves, share wealth equally, and elect their leaders spread beyond the docks and taverns. When the American colonies began to speak of liberty decades later, some of those same principles resurfaced in their writings. The pirates had been erased from official history, but their spirit had already drifted ashore. Some said the real treasure of the Caribbean was never the gold taken from Spanish galleons. It was the idea of freedom itself. The realization that men, even outlaws and exiles, could build something without kings or crowns. In this sense, the pirates didn't vanish. They evolved. Their defiance seeped into the world like salt water, unseen, but everywhere. The merchant ships that replaced them carried their songs. The sailors who once feared them carried their memory, and the empires that destroyed them quietly borrowed their methods, shares, discipline, codes, and contracts. Every organized crew at sea owed something to Nassau. A merchant's journal from 1738 records a peculiar entry. At dawn, near the old Bahama route, we sighted a black flag atop a mastless wreck. It drifted with no crew aboard. The flag was ragged and half-torn, but one could still make out the skull. My men feared it was an omen. I told them it was only the wind, but I confess, when the fog rolled in, I thought I heard laughter upon the water. To some, it was imagination. To others, a warning that Nassau's spirit never truly died. Generations passed. The age of sail gave way to steam. The oceans grew busier, louder, more tamed. But whenever the waves crash against the rocks of New Providence, there's a rhythm there, a steady echo like boots on wood, like drums from another time. And if you stand long enough by the shore at dusk, you might swear you can still see them, the outlines of old ships rising in the mist, the faint glimmer of lanterns swaying in invisible hands. The Republic of Pirates, reborn in memory. It's strange how history buries what it fears most. Empires can celebrate their wars, their kings, their conquerors, but they rarely honor those who proved freedom could exist without them. That's what Nassau represented, not chaos, but proof. Proof that common men could govern themselves, proof that equality could be real, even if it was born among thieves. They failed, yes, but their failure was glorious. Because in every generation since, there have been echoes of Nassau. Whenever someone chooses liberty over obedience, whenever voices rise against injustice, whenever men and women decide that the old order no longer fits the new world. Every revolution begins as a whisper. Nassau was the first. The Caribbean has long since changed. Tourists now walk the same beaches where pirates once buried silver. Children play near the remains of the old fort. Few know that beneath those sands lies one of the most extraordinary experiments in human history. The Republic of Pirates wasn't just a myth, it was a mirror. It showed humanity both its best and worst selves. Greed and equality, cruelty and compassion, lawlessness and justice, all aboard the same ship. That's why its story endures. Because in every age, there are still those who dream of a world without kings. Some nights, fishermen still claim to see strange lights far out to sea, near the old Spanish trade routes. They move slow and silent, too steady for waves, too organized for chance. They say it's the ghosts of the old fleet, still sailing the waters they once ruled. Others say it's Liberty Cay, that secret haven, alive again beneath the stars. Whether that's true doesn't matter. What matters is that the legend still sails. Because legends, like the sea, never die. The Republic of Pirates ended in chains and executions, but its spirit seeped into history like spilled rum, sweet, burning, unforgettable. From the decks of the Queen Anne's Revenge to the gallows at Port Royal, these men and women carved their rebellion into the bones of empire. They weren't heroes, they weren't villains, they were something far rarer. They were free. And freedom, once tasted, never truly fades. The sea took them all in the end, but the tide they started still rolls on, across centuries, through revolutions, through every voice that dares to defy the crown. So when you hear the ocean at night, listen carefully. Beneath the crash of waves, you might hear it, the faint echo of laughter, the call of the free, the whisper of the Republic of Pirates. As the years passed, Nassau's transformation became complete. The once lawless haven of free men was now an obedient port of empire. Red-coated soldiers marched where barefoot pirates had once sung. The taverns that echoed with shanties and arguments over shares were replaced by counting houses, their windows glowing with the yellow light of men tallying profits that no longer belonged to them. The wooden docks, once stained with the tar of captured ships, now bore the royal crest on every beam. And yet even in this new order, something remained. The spirit of those who had lived outside the laws of kings had soaked into the island itself. Visitors to Nassau often remarked that the locals carried themselves with a strange confidence, a quiet independence that couldn't quite be traced to loyalty to any flag. It was as if the island itself remembered what it once had been. Woodes Rogers ruled as best he could, but the position aged him quickly. The man who had arrived full of determination to civilize the pirates now found himself surrounded by men who respected him, but never truly loved him. They obeyed because they had to, not because they believed. When storms came and trade slowed, Rogers began to see the cracks in his creation. The pardoned pirates were restless. Some slipped away on dark nights, never to return. Others took to smuggling, moving contraband under the noses of the same officers they had once fought beside. By the late 1720s, Rogers' health had declined. His letters to London were desperate, filled with complaints about lack of funding and the impossible task of keeping order among men who had been born to disobey. He died in debt, a sick and weary man who never truly understood that the world he'd tried to destroy had only gone into hiding. Nassau bowed its head to his memory, but in truth, the people mourned more for the days of danger and freedom than for the man who had ended them. For those who still remembered the Golden Age, the past was not a story but a shadow. The sea had taken their comrades, their ships, their fortunes, but not their memories. They carried those with them wherever they went, in the docks of Kingston, in the taverns of Havana, in the markets of Bridgetown. There were always old men who had once been pirates, telling stories in voices that trembled but never lost their pride. They spoke of Bellamy, who believed that men could be fair even in defiance. of Hornigold, who had tried to give pirates a nation, of Anne and Mary, who fought like legends when the world told them they had no right to fight at all, of Blackbeard, whose smoke and fury turned fear into a weapon, of Roberts, who built order from chaos and died before surrender. Their names were curses to the empire, but to the people of the sea, they were something closer to saints. As time went on, their stories traveled farther than any of them ever had. Sailors carried them to the Americas, to Africa, to the ports of Europe. Writers turned them into myths. Painters gave them faces they never had. Each retelling added something, exaggerated something else, until truth and legend became one and the same. But beneath the myth, the core remained, the idea that freedom was worth the cost. By the middle of the 18th century, the age of sail had changed. Merchant empires grew fat on trade. Warships grew larger, more disciplined, more deadly. The chaotic courage of the pirate fleets seemed impossible in this new world. Yet the echo of Nassau lived on in quiet ways. Merchant crews began to demand fairer treatment and pay. Some captains allowed votes on routes or rations. The democratic habits that had once been born in rebellion now crept quietly into the systems of law. It was as if the republic the pirates had built refused to die. It had simply gone underground, carried in the hearts of men who refused to forget. Every few years, there were rumors. A ship sighted near the Florida Straits flying no colors. A mysterious vessel that hailed no port, fired no shot, but vanished when pursued. Sailors said it was one of the old ships crewed by ghosts. Others whispered that it was the descendants of the Nassau men, still living free somewhere beyond the reach of kings. No one ever proved it, and perhaps no one wanted to. Some stories lose their power when they're proven true. The Caribbean itself seemed to keep the secret. Its reefs, its uncharted coves, its endless islands, so many places a man could disappear. Every captain knew there were parts of those waters that felt wrong, as if watched. Some swore they'd seen campfires burning on islands marked uninhabited. Others found empty huts, nets hanging, footprints in the sand that led nowhere. The sea held too many ghosts to count. When British officers spoke of the suppression of piracy, they did so with pride. They wrote reports to London boasting that the seas were safe again, that order had returned. But sailors who knew the waters would shake their heads and mutter that the sea belonged to no one. The empires might have maps and guns, but the ocean had memory, and memory was the one thing they couldn't control. By 1750, a generation had passed since the fall of Nassau, but the ideals of its people began to appear in the strangest of places. In London coffeehouses, radicals discussed equality and self-rule. In Boston and Philadelphia, colonists debated the rights of men to govern themselves. Some of those same men had once been sailors, their fathers or grandfathers perhaps among the crews who had flown the black flag. The pirates had been called criminals, but their dreams had been contagious. The concept of a people ruling themselves without a king, an idea once punished by hanging, had taken root. It would grow quietly for decades before it exploded into revolution, and when it did, it would carry within it the same heartbeat that once pounded on the decks of ships anchored in Nassau's Bay. There is an unbroken thread that runs through time, invisible but undeniable. From the decks of the Benjamin, where Hornigold's men voted on raids, to the meeting halls of Nassau, where pirates debated like statesmen, to the ships of Bellamy and Roberts, where men of all races shared equal shares of loot and respect, to the ink-stained hands that wrote declarations and constitutions in the New World. The words changed, but the spirit was the same. Freedom, shared equally. Even the laws of the sea kept traces of the pirate codes. The right to vote on ship matters, the equal division of prize money, the duty of care toward injured crew, all of it drawn, directly or indirectly, from those first experiments in the Bahamas. It was as if, despite every effort to erase them, the pirates had written their names into the law itself. But memory fades, and power prefers silence. The kings and merchants who had once cursed the pirates now profited from their legacy while pretending it had never existed. In public, they called the black flag a symbol of savagery. In private, they studied it for lessons on control, organization, and loyalty. Even empire had learned from rebellion. And still the sea whispered. By the end of the 18th century, when the last of the old pirates were long dead, their stories became a strange mix of warning and wonder. Parents told their children tales of the wicked men who defied the crown, while secretly admiring their courage. Artists painted them as both monsters and heroes. Writers filled pages with their names: Blackbeard, Bellamy, Bonny, Rackham, turning history into legend, legend into morality. But the truth never fit neatly into those stories. The truth was that they had been ordinary men and women, pushed by circumstance, shaped by war, betrayed by peace. They were sailors abandoned by their nations, soldiers without a cause, workers denied the fruits of their labor. In the void left by empire's neglect, they built something radical, something that worked, even if only for a brief, burning moment. It is said that every revolution begins with desperation and ends with betrayal. The Republic of Pirates was no different, but for a few short years under the blazing Caribbean sun, they proved that the powerless could create order without masters, that law could exist without tyranny, that equality could flourish even among thieves. And though their bodies turned to dust, their ideals did not. They became part of the collective dream that would later move mountains and topple kings. Every cry for freedom carried an echo of Nassau's defiance. Even now, when ships pass over the old routes where the treasure fleet sank in 1715, divers still find pieces of silver among the coral, coins blackened by centuries underwater. When held to the light, they gleam faintly, as if the sea itself refuses to let go of its secrets. Some say those coins are cursed, that they bring misfortune to anyone who takes them. But others claim they're blessed, that they belong to no one, because they were earned by no king, no country, only by courage. Perhaps that's the truest legacy of Nassau, that no matter how much the world changes, some treasures aren't made of gold. They're made of ideas that refuse to drown. The Caribbean night remains the same as it was 3 centuries ago. Warm, heavy with salt, the horizon dotted with faint lights from passing ships. The trade winds still hum the same quiet tune. The reefs still glow faintly beneath the moon. And if you stand alone on the sands of New Providence, where Nassau once roared with laughter and rebellion, you might feel it, that same pulse, faint but alive, beating through the earth, whispering through the waves. The empires came and went, the crowns changed hands, but the sea, like freedom, belongs to no one. And perhaps somewhere beyond the edge of any map, that's where the Republic of Pirates still sails, unseen, waiting for those who remember what it stood for. Even after 300 years, that story still clings to the air over Nassau like humidity that never lifts. The island looks different now. White hotels where the old taverns stood, cruise ships where the brigantines once anchored, but anyone who spends a night by the water feels it. Something lingers in the salt breeze, something older than the maps that renamed every corner of the Caribbean. Tour guides speak of empire, of trade, of sugar and slavery. But the locals, when the crowds have gone and the night gets quiet, tell a different story. They talk about lights that move across the horizon in perfect formation, of songs carried on the wind that no one remembers learning. They talk about the old harbor, where fishermen sometimes find ancient cannonballs tangled in their nets, or fragments of wood carved with strange marks, symbols that were once stamped on the hulls of pirate ships to tell their own kind who they were. In the cemeteries, A few headstones remain unmarked. The dates have worn away, the inscriptions gone. No one knows who lies there, but sometimes people leave coins, small offerings to spirits who refuse to kneel. Even now, in the 21st century, the island keeps them company. Because Nassau isn't just a place, it's a reminder. Every empire builds its walls and writes its laws, but there's always an edge of the map where obedience ends. The men and women of the Republic found that edge and decided to stay there. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for orders. They simply lived the only way they knew, by the rules they made for themselves. When historians talk about them, they call it a failed experiment, a footnote in the history of colonial rebellion. But failure isn't the right word. What they built lasted longer than anyone expected because it wasn't made of wood or stone. It was made of belief. The belief that every man and woman, no matter their birth, deserved a voice. The belief that leadership could be earned, not inherited. The belief that fairness could exist even among thieves. These beliefs didn't die with the hangings in Port Royal. They crossed oceans. They found new homes in the hearts of people who never saw the Caribbean. The very language of rebellion that shaped future revolutions, the right to vote, the equality of all men, the power of consent, carried whispers from Nassau's deck councils and articles of agreement. The Republic's ghosts followed the trade winds. They rode the ships that left its ruins, hidden in the songs of sailors, in the laughter of dock workers, in the grumbling of men who'd once been free. They reached Europe, America, Africa, anywhere the sea touched. Freedom has always traveled that way, unseen, but unstoppable. Sometimes it surfaces unexpectedly. A shipwreck revealed after a hurricane, its timbers blackened, but intact. Inside, a chest filled not with gold, but with paper. Lists of names written in uneven ink. Crews, agreements, votes, evidence that for a time, democracy floated on the tide. When those artifacts reach museums, they sit behind glass, tagged as curiosities. Visitors glance, read a plaque, move on. But if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear the creak of wood and the distant echo of waves. You can imagine the hands that wrote those words, the men and women who believed that justice could exist even in lawlessness. They were rough people, violent people, but they dared to ask a question that frightened every empire. What happens when ordinary people decide they don't need kings at all? That question never stopped traveling. It lived in the pamphlets of revolutionaries, in the letters of philosophers, in the shouts that filled the streets of new republics rising centuries later. Each one carried, buried somewhere in its language, the same defiance that had once filled Nassau's harbor. The world forgot their faces, but not their idea. The sea still keeps their memory. On windless nights when the water lies flat as glass, sailors say you can sometimes see patterns beneath the surface, shadows of hulls that shouldn't be there, drifting in formation. They move silently, parallel to one another, as though following old routes that the ocean itself refuses to erase. Then they fade, leaving nothing but ripples and the smell of salt. Some call them illusions, tricks of light. Others say they are the Republic's fleet, forever sailing between this world and the next, bound to the code that no empire could destroy. Maybe they're right. Because freedom, once written, doesn't die. It submerges, waiting for the right tide to rise again. And somewhere far beyond the sound of commerce and empire, a lantern still swings above the waves, marking the invisible harbor of the free.